Hello there, and welcome to our gentle journey tonight. I want you to imagine Chicago in 1910, a city humming with possibility and danger. On the South Side, a quiet revolution was beginning, one that would reshape organized crime in America forever. A man named Big Jim Colosimo was weaving something extraordinary in the shadows of the Levee district, creating the very first threads of what would become the Chicago outfit. Tonight, we'll softly trace how this humble beginning grew into America's most enduring criminal empire. Starting with one man's simple idea about control. Picture a man pushing a broom down Harrison Street in 1902, dust swirling around his worn boots as horse-drawn carriages clatter past. Jim Colosimo looked like any other immigrant trying to make his way in America's second city. He swept the sidewalks outside saloons and gambling halls, emptied spittoons and mopped floors sticky with spilled beer and whiskey. But while his hands worked, his mind was busy with something far more interesting than cleaning. Jim had arrived from southern Italy just a few years earlier, carrying nothing but ambition and a sharp understanding of people. As he swept those streets day after day, he began to notice patterns that others missed completely. He watched how certain men walked with confidence through neighborhoods where others hurried past with their heads down. He saw how police officers would nod respectfully to some saloon owners while harassing others for the same violations. Most fascinating of all, he observed how money and favors flowed like invisible rivers between the legitimate world of politics and the shadowy world of vice. The South Side's Levee district was a maze of contradictions that fascinated Jim. During daylight hours, reformers would march through demanding moral cleanup. Politicians would give speeches about virtue and family values. Newspapers would write angry editorials about the corruption festering in their midst. But when darkness fell, these same politicians would slip quietly through back doors into gambling parlors. Police captains would collect their weekly envelopes from brothel madams. Businessmen would drink expensive champagne with the very people they condemned in public. Jim realized that everyone was playing a careful game of pretense. The district needed to exist because it generated too much money and political support to eliminate. But it also needed to appear scandalous enough to satisfy the public's desire for moral outrage. This delicate balance created opportunities for someone clever enough to understand both sides of the equation. His keen eye for human nature became his most valuable tool. Jim could read people's motivations within minutes of meeting them. He understood that the Italian fruit vendor worried about protection from gangs who might destroy his cart. The Irish factory worker needed someone who could help him find steady employment. The Polish seamstress wanted her son kept out of trouble with the law. Every person had needs that the official system couldn't or wouldn't address. Jim began offering small services to his fellow immigrants. He would translate documents for families who spoke no English. He helped men find work through connections he was building with labor foremen. When disputes arose between neighbors, people started asking Jim to mediate because they trusted his fairness. He never asked for payment directly, but grateful families would invite him for dinner, introduce him to relatives, and spread word of his helpfulness throughout the community. His natural charisma drew people to him in ways that surprised everyone, including Jim himself. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but when he spoke, people listened. His voice carried genuine warmth that made others feel understood and protected. He remembered names, asked about families, and showed genuine interest in people's struggles. On cold Chicago nights, immigrants would gather around Jim like he was a warming fire, sharing their problems and seeking his advice. Word of Jim's growing influence reached the ears of established political figures in the ward. Precinct captains began approaching him, recognizing that he could deliver votes from the Italian community better than anyone else. They offered him small positions within the local Democratic organization, understanding that his connections were becoming too valuable to ignore. Jim accepted these roles eagerly, seeing them as windows into how the real power structure operated. Through his political connections, Jim learned the art of mutual benefit. He discovered that aldermen needed reliable vote counts during elections. Police sergeants needed informants who could help them solve crimes that mattered to their superiors. Saloon owners needed someone who could smooth over problems with licensing officials. Everyone needed someone they could trust completely, and Jim was methodically making himself that person for as many people as possible. The transformation happened, gradually over several years. Jim stopped carrying a broom and started wearing better clothes. People began addressing him as Mr. Colosimo, rather than just Jim. When problems arose in the neighborhood, residents would ask, "Have you talked to Big Jim about this?" The nickname wasn't about his physical size, but about the space he occupied in people's minds when they needed help or guidance. Jim understood something that would become the foundation of everything he built later. Real power didn't come from threatening people or demanding tribute. It came from making yourself so useful, so connected, and so trustworthy that people couldn't imagine solving their problems without your help. When you became indispensable to enough people, you gained influence that no amount of violence could create. By 1905, Jim had established himself as an unofficial community leader who could open doors that remained closed to other immigrants. Factory foremen would hire men on Jim's recommendation. Police would listen when Jim vouched for someone's character. Politicians would take meetings with people Jim brought to see them. He had created a network of relationships that operated parallel to the official systems, filling gaps that government couldn't or wouldn't address. The Italian community began bringing their most serious problems to Jim's attention. When young men got involved with street gangs, their mothers would ask Jim to intervene. When families faced eviction, Jim would connect them with sympathetic landlords or help them negotiate payment plans. When someone needed a job, a loan, or protection from harassment, Jim's name came up in conversation as the person who could make things happen. Jim's approach was creating something entirely new in American organized crime. Instead of ruling through fear, he built loyalty through service. Instead of demanding tribute, he created mutual obligations. Instead of fighting the system, he found ways to work within it while serving needs that the system ignored. This gentle approach was planting seeds that would grow into the most sophisticated criminal organization America had ever seen. From those dusty streets where he once pushed a broom, Jim Colosimo had discovered the secret that would define the Chicago outfit for generations to come. Power built on relationships and trust would prove far more durable than power built on violence and intimidation. Just south of downtown Chicago, between 18th and 22nd Streets, lay a neighborhood that operated by its own mysterious rules. The Levee district was a place where piano music spilled from doorways at all hours, where men in expensive suits walked arm in arm with women in silk dresses, and where money changed hands in ways that would have shocked proper society. This wasn't some hidden underground world, tucked away in basements and back alleys. The Levee existed in plain sight, with bright electric signs advertising its pleasures and brass bands playing on street corners to draw in customers. During the day, you might see well-dressed businessmen hurrying through the district with their eyes fixed straight ahead, pretending not to notice the colorful establishments on either side. Reformers would march through carrying signs demanding moral cleanup, their voices echoing off the brick buildings as they called for the closure of gambling halls and houses of ill repute. Newspaper reporters would write angry articles about the corruption festering in Chicago's heart, describing the district as a cancer that needed immediate surgery. But when evening shadows began to fall across the city, something magical happened. In the Levee, those same businessmen who had hurried past during daylight would return through side doors, their earlier moral concerns apparently forgotten. Police officers who had looked stern and disapproving in the afternoon would tip their caps politely to madams and saloon owners. Politicians who gave speeches about family values would quietly slip into back rooms to discuss arrangements that benefited everyone involved. The district thrived on this beautiful contradiction between public disapproval and private participation. Everyone understood the game being played, even if they pretended otherwise. City officials needed the levee because it generated enormous amounts of tax revenue and provided jobs for thousands of people. It also served as a convenient place to contain activities that couldn't be eliminated but could be controlled. Politicians found the district useful because brothel owners and gambling hall operators were reliable sources of campaign contributions and could deliver votes from neighborhoods throughout the city. This careful balance created opportunities for someone smart enough to understand both worlds. The legitimate business community needed someone who could communicate with the underground economy. The underground operators needed someone who could navigate the political system. Police needed reliable informants who could help them solve crimes that mattered to their superiors. Everyone needed someone they could trust completely, someone who understood the unspoken rules that kept this delicate ecosystem functioning. Jim saw these needs with perfect clarity, and he positioned himself as the solution to problems that nobody wanted to discuss openly. He understood that the Levee district wasn't chaotic at all, despite appearances. It operated according to complex systems of mutual benefit, shared risk, and carefully negotiated boundaries. The problem was that these systems had developed organically over time, without central coordination, creating inefficiencies and conflicts that hurt everyone's profits. The brothel owners competed against each other so fiercely that they often drove down prices and attracted unwanted police attention. Gambling hall operators frequently got into disputes over territory that could escalate into violence, bringing heat from city officials who preferred quiet corruption to public scandals. Saloon owners faced constant pressure from temperance groups and needed political protection that they had to negotiate individually, making them vulnerable to changing political winds. Jim began offering his services as a coordinator, someone who could help these various enterprises work together more effectively. He suggested that brothel owners could avoid destructive competition by agreeing to serve different types of customers or operate in different neighborhoods. He proposed that gambling hall operators could resolve disputes through arbitration, rather than violence, keeping their activities below the radar of reform movements. He showed saloon owners how they could pool their political contributions to gain stronger protection than any of them could achieve individually. His approach required delicate relationship building on both sides of the legal divide. Jim would spend mornings meeting with aldermen and police captains, discussing neighborhood concerns and offering to help solve problems through his community connections. He would spend evenings in the Levee district, talking with business owners about their challenges and suggesting ways that better political relationships could improve their situations. Jim never demanded payment for these services directly. Instead, he created a system based on mutual obligation and shared benefit. When a brothel owner needed help with a licensing problem, Jim would use his political connections to smooth things over. In return, the grateful owner might hire Jim's relatives for legitimate jobs or recommend his services to other operators. When a gambling hall faced pressure from reform groups, Jim would help shift public attention to other issues. The hall owner would remember Jim's assistance when political campaigns needed financial support. This informal system of favors and obligations gradually evolved into something more structured. Jim began collecting modest fees from various enterprises in the district, not as tribute or protection money, but as payment for genuine services. He helped coordinate delivery schedules to avoid conflicts between different establishments. He provided security consultation to prevent robberies and violence that would attract unwanted attention. He served as a communication link between the underground economy and legitimate political power. The beauty of Jim's system was that everyone benefited from the arrangements he created. Police received better cooperation from district operators, making their jobs easier and their superiors happier. Politicians gained access to reliable funding and vote delivery that strengthened their positions. Business owners in the district enjoyed reduced competition, better political protection, and more predictable operating conditions. Even reform groups found that Jim's coordination reduced the visible violence and disorder that had made the Levee such an easy target for public outrage. Jim's reputation as the unofficial coordinator of the district spread throughout Chicago's political circles. Aldermen would ask for his input on policies affecting the South Side. Police commanders would consult with him before planning operations in sensitive areas. Business leaders would seek his advice on how to navigate the complex relationships between legitimate commerce and underground activities. Within just a few years, Jim had become the person that everyone in the Levee district turned to when they needed problems solved. His office in a modest building on South Wabash Avenue became an informal city hall where disputes were resolved, partnerships were arranged, and the delicate balance between legal and illegal activities was maintained. He had created something entirely new in American organized crime, a system based on cooperation and mutual benefit rather than fear and intimidation. This gentle approach to territorial control would become the signature characteristic of the Chicago outfit for decades to come. Jim had proven that lasting power came not from conquest, but from making yourself indispensable to everyone around you. Most criminals who tried to influence Chicago politics made the same basic mistake. They would walk into an alderman's office with a suitcase full of cash, thinking money alone could buy protection and cooperation. These crude attempts usually backfired spectacularly, creating enemies instead of allies and attracting exactly the kind of attention that destroyed criminal enterprises. Jim understood something that his competitors missed completely. Politicians didn't need more money nearly as much as they needed reliable solutions to the problems that kept them awake at night. Chicago's political machine operated like a massive, complicated engine that required constant maintenance and careful feeding. Ward bosses needed to deliver votes during elections or risk losing their positions to hungrier rivals. Aldermen needed to keep their constituents happy while also satisfying the demands of party leaders and business interests. Police captains needed to maintain order in their districts while avoiding scandals that could end their careers. Each of these men faced daily challenges that official channels couldn't address effectively. Jim made himself the answer to problems that politicians couldn't solve through normal means. When a ward boss needed to register hundreds of new Italian immigrants as voters before an upcoming election, Jim would organize the entire process. He would gather the paperwork, escort groups of men to the registration office, and make sure they understood which candidates deserved their loyalty. When an alderman faced pressure from constituents about crime in their neighborhood, Jim would use his connections in the Levee district to identify troublemakers and convince them to move their activities elsewhere. The Democratic Party machinery in Chicago's First Ward recognized Jim's growing influence and offered him an official position as precinct captain. This role gave him legitimate authority to organize voters and coordinate political activities, but it also provided something much more valuable. Jim now had regular access to party meetings, where he could observe how decisions were made and where power truly resided. He learned which aldermen held real influence and which ones were just figureheads. He discovered which police commanders could actually deliver on their promises and which ones were all talk. Jim's new position required him to master the delicate art of vote management. He would visit immigrant families in their homes, explaining how local elections would affect their daily lives. He helped them understand which candidates supported policies that benefited working families and which ones served only wealthy interests. On election day, Jim would coordinate transportation to polling stations, making sure that elderly voters and working parents could participate despite their busy schedules. The results spoke for themselves. Jim's precinct consistently delivered some of the highest vote totals in the city, with margins that made party leaders very happy. More importantly, these weren't bought votes that might disappear when the money ran out. Jim had created genuine loyalty by connecting political participation to real improvements in people's lives. Families who voted for Jim's recommended candidates would see their sons get jobs with the city. Small business owners would find that licensing problems got resolved more quickly. Immigrants would discover that police treated them with more respect. Beyond vote delivery, Jim provided another service that politicians found invaluable. He became their bagman, handling financial transactions that they couldn't manage directly. When campaign contributions needed to be collected from businesses in the Levee district, Jim would make the rounds, personally. When money needed to be distributed to loyal supporters or helpful officials, Jim would handle those arrangements with complete discretion. Politicians could maintain plausible distance from these transactions, while still benefiting from them. Jim's reliability in these sensitive matters became legendary among Chicago's political class. He never shorted anyone their agreed-upon share, never talked about transactions to unauthorized people, and never used his knowledge of financial arrangements to threaten or blackmail anyone. This absolute trustworthiness made him incredibly valuable to politicians who worked in a world where betrayal could destroy careers overnight. The small favors Jim performed for political allies created bonds that went far beyond simple business relationships. When Alderman Johnny Powers needed someone to mediate a dispute between Irish and Italian dockworkers, Jim would spend hours talking with both groups until they reached a peaceful solution. When Police Captain William O'Brien's son got into trouble at school, Jim would have a quiet conversation with the boy and make sure he understood the importance of staying out of additional problems. Jim remembered the personal details that mattered to his political friends. He would ask about their wives' health, their children's progress in school, and their concerns about aging parents. During holiday seasons, Jim would send thoughtful gifts that showed genuine attention to individual preferences. When family emergencies arose, Jim would offer practical help without being asked, whether that meant finding a good doctor, arranging transportation, or simply providing a sympathetic ear during difficult times. These personal connections created an invisible shield around Jim's operations that proved more effective than any amount of muscle or intimidation. When reform movements targeted the Levee district, Jim's political friends would find ways to redirect attention to other issues. When federal investigators asked local officials about organized crime activities, those officials would honestly report that Big Jim Colosimo was a respected community leader who helped maintain peace in a challenging neighborhood. Jim's political protection operated so smoothly that most people didn't even realize it existed. Police raids in the Levee district would happen just often enough to satisfy public demands for action, but they would never seriously disrupt the businesses that mattered. Licensing inspections would focus on establishments that weren't part of Jim's network, while his associates would receive advance warning about any official attention. Court cases involving Jim's people would somehow get assigned to judges who understood the importance of keeping the peace in complicated neighborhoods. The beauty of Jim's system was that everyone involved could maintain their public image while participating in mutually beneficial arrangements. Politicians could give speeches about law and order while privately working with Jim to maintain actual order in ways that official channels couldn't achieve. Police officials could enforce the law selectively, focusing their attention on problems that truly threatened public safety, while overlooking activities that generated revenue and remained relatively peaceful. Jim had achieved something that no other criminal leader in America had managed to create. His organization operated with blanket political protection that allowed unprecedented freedom of movement and expansion. This wasn't protection bought through fear or corruption, but genuine cooperation based on shared interests and mutual respect. The political strategy Jim developed would become the Chicago outfit's secret weapon for generations to come. Long after his death, the organization would continue using his patient approach to relationship building, understanding that true power came from making yourself indispensable to the very people who were supposed to stop you. Success sometimes creates problems that are harder to solve than failure ever was. By 1915, Jim's network had grown far beyond what he had imagined when he first started organizing his fellow immigrants. His influence stretched across multiple neighborhoods. His political connections reached into City Hall, and his coordination of the Levee district had created a steady stream of revenue that required constant attention. The operation had become too complex for one person to manage effectively. No matter how talented or dedicated that person might be, Jim faced a challenge that would have destroyed most criminal enterprises. He needed to expand his leadership team, but finding the right person meant navigating dangerous waters. Most local candidates came with their own established relationships and ambitions that could create conflicts within the organization. Some had connections to rival groups that might compromise Jim's carefully built network of trust. Others possessed a kind of aggressive personalities that could upset the delicate balance Jim had created with political and law enforcement officials. The situation required someone who combined complete loyalty with exceptional business skills. Jim needed a person who understood criminal operations but could also appreciate the subtle political relationships that formed the foundation of his success. This combination of qualities was almost impossible to find among Chicago's established criminal population, where most leaders had built their reputations through violence rather than diplomacy. The solution came from an unexpected source. Jim's sister Anna had married into a family with deep roots in New York's underworld, and her son Johnny Torrio had been making quite a name for himself in Brooklyn's organized crime circles. Johnny was barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than most teenagers, but those who underestimated him based on his appearance quickly learned to regret that mistake. He possessed a sharp analytical mind that could break down complex problems into manageable pieces, and he understood how to organize people and resources with remarkable efficiency. Jim had been following his young nephew's progress in New York with growing interest. Johnny had worked his way up through the ranks of several criminal organizations, learning different approaches to territory management, revenue collection, and conflict resolution. Unlike many criminals who relied on intimidation and violence, Johnny preferred systematic methods that produced consistent results with minimal risk. He studied legitimate businesses to understand how successful organizations operated, then applied those principles to criminal enterprises. When Jim invited Johnny to visit Chicago in 1915, he was bringing together two completely different approaches to organized crime. Jim's method relied heavily on personal relationships, community connections, and political influence. Johnny's approach emphasized systematic organization, careful record-keeping, and mathematical analysis of profit and loss. At first glance, these styles seemed incompatible, but Jim recognized that their combination could create something more powerful than either approach alone. Johnny arrived in Chicago and immediately began studying Jim's operation with the same careful attention he had applied to his New York activities. He was impressed by the political protection Jim had built, understanding that such relationships provided security that no amount of firepower could match. At the same time, Johnny identified opportunities for improvement in areas where Jim's personal approach had created inefficiencies. The partnership that emerged combined Jim's political genius with Johnny's organizational expertise in ways that transformed their entire operation. Jim continued to handle the relationship building that kept politicians, police, and community leaders supportive of their activities. Johnny focused on systematizing their business operations, creating clear territorial boundaries, establishing regular collection schedules, and developing accounting methods that tracked income and expenses with precision. Johnny brought modern management techniques to what had been a traditional Italian-American family operation. He created detailed maps showing which areas generated the most revenue, which competitors posed potential threats, and which neighborhoods offered expansion opportunities. He established regular meetings where different parts of the organization could coordinate their activities and share important information. He developed systems for recruiting new members, training them in proper procedures, and evaluating their performance over time. The combination of Jim's political connections with Johnny's systematic approach opened up expansion possibilities that neither man could have achieved alone. Jim's relationships provided the protection and legitimacy needed to operate in new areas. Johnny's organizational skills ensured that expansion efforts were planned carefully and executed efficiently. Together, they began extending their influence beyond the Levee district into neighborhoods throughout Chicago's South and West Sides. Their expansion strategy focused on areas where they could replicate the successful model Jim had developed in the Levee district. They looked for neighborhoods with significant immigrant populations who needed the kind of services and protection that official channels couldn't provide. They identified local political figures who might benefit from the vote delivery and financial support that Jim's organization could offer. They studied existing criminal activities to understand how their coordination services could reduce conflicts and increase profits for everyone involved. Johnny's arrival also marked a shift in how the organization handled territorial disputes and competitive challenges. While Jim had always preferred negotiation over violence, Johnny brought more sophisticated strategies for dealing with rivals who couldn't be reasoned with or bought off. He understood how to use economic pressure, political influence, and strategic alliances to neutralize threats without creating the kind of public violence that attracted unwanted attention. The partnership established a new model for criminal leadership that would influence organized crime families throughout America. Instead of relying on a single charismatic leader, they created a system where different types of expertise could work together effectively. Jim's political and community relations skills complemented Johnny's business and organizational abilities, creating an operation that was more resilient and adaptable than traditional criminal enterprises. Their collaboration also demonstrated how family connections could provide the trust foundation necessary for criminal partnerships, while bringing together different regional approaches and experiences. Johnny's New York background introduced Chicago methods and perspectives that enhanced their competitive advantages, while Jim's established Chicago relationships provided the local knowledge and protection that made expansion possible. The Colosimo partnership created something entirely new in American organized crime. They had built the first truly modern criminal syndicate, one that combined old-world traditions of family loyalty and community service with New World efficiency and systematic organization. Their approach balanced the personal relationships that provided political protection with the business methods that maximized profits and minimized risks. This collaboration established the leadership model that would guide the Chicago outfit through its greatest periods of growth and success. Future generations of leaders would continue using their balanced approach, understanding that lasting criminal enterprises required both political sophistication and business expertise. The foundation they built together would prove strong enough to survive leadership changes, federal investigations, and decades of social and economic transformation. When Congress passed the Volstead Act in 1919, most people saw it as the end of an era. Saloon owners across America watched their livelihoods disappear overnight. Bartenders looked for new jobs. Brewery workers packed up their tools and searched for different trades. In Chicago's criminal underworld, panic spread through organizations that had built their entire operations around the saloon business. Many criminal leaders saw their primary source of income vanishing like morning mist, leaving them scrambling to find new ways to survive. Jim and Johnny approached the news with curious calm, while their competitors worried about losing the saloon revenues that had sustained them for decades. The two partners spent long evenings discussing what this dramatic change might actually mean. They understood something that their panicking rivals had missed completely. The law could ban the sale of alcohol, but it couldn't eliminate the human desire to drink. Millions of Americans had been enjoying beer, wine, and whiskey for generations. These people weren't going to suddenly decide they preferred milk and lemonade Just because politicians in Washington had passed a new law, the more they studied the situation, the more convinced they became that Prohibition represented the greatest business opportunity in American history. Think about it from a basic supply and demand perspective. The government was about to eliminate the legal supply of alcohol, while leaving demand completely unchanged. This artificial scarcity would drive prices through the roof, creating profit margins that legitimate businesses could never achieve. At the same time, the complexity of illegal alcohol distribution would favor organizations that already understood how to operate outside normal business channels. Jim recognized that their existing political protection system could adapt to bootlegging more easily than anyone imagined. The same aldermen who had overlooked gambling and prostitution in the Levee district would find ways to ignore illegal alcohol sales, especially if those sales generated the tax revenue and political support they needed. Police commanders who had learned to work with Jim's organization would continue those relationships, understanding that bootlegging operations could be managed just like any other vice activity. Johnny focused on the practical challenges of transforming their saloon network into something that could operate under Prohibition. Their established locations already had the right customers, the right atmosphere, and the right political protection. Converting legitimate saloons into illegal speakeasies required surprisingly few changes. They would need to install hidden doors and secret entrances. They would have to develop signals that let regular customers know when it was safe to enter. They would need to create systems for hiding alcohol during police raids that everyone knew would be mostly for show. The transformation happened with remarkable smoothness. Their saloon on South Wabash Avenue became a speakeasy where customers entered through a basement entrance and gave a password to gain admission. Their gambling hall on 21st Street started serving cocktails alongside poker games, with lookouts posted to watch for unwelcome visitors. Their brothels began offering premium liquor to clients who wanted to combine their entertainment with fine drinking, creating new revenue streams that hadn't existed before. Jim and Johnny started experimenting with alcohol importation almost immediately after Prohibition took effect. Canada remained perfectly legal to produce and export alcohol, creating obvious opportunities for American entrepreneurs willing to handle the transportation challenges. They established connections with distilleries in Windsor, Ontario, just across the Detroit River from the American border. They developed relationships with boat captains who could transport cases of Canadian whiskey across the Great Lakes to Chicago's shoreline. Their early smuggling operations taught them valuable lessons about logistics and security. They learned which border crossings were most heavily patrolled and which ones could be crossed with minimal risk. They discovered that Coast Guard patrols followed predictable patterns that could be studied and avoided. They found that customs officials could often be persuaded to look the other way when the right incentives were offered at the right times. The distribution network they created reached far beyond their traditional territory in the Levee district. Johnny's systematic approach helped them identify neighborhoods throughout Chicago where demand for illegal alcohol was highest and competition was weakest. They established relationships with restaurant owners who wanted to offer cocktails to their customers. They connected with social club managers who needed reliable suppliers for private parties. They found hotel operators who were willing to provide room service alcohol for guests willing to pay premium prices. One of the most surprising developments was how Prohibition actually strengthened their relationships with political officials. Before 1920, politicians could maintain some distance from vice activities, claiming they were simply tolerating necessary evils that couldn't be completely eliminated. After Prohibition, those same politicians found themselves in much more complicated positions. They needed to appear supportive of the new law, while also managing the reality that millions of their constituents wanted to continue drinking. Jim and Johnny became valuable allies for politicians who were trying to navigate these contradictions. They could ensure that bootlegging activities in their territories remained peaceful and discreet, avoiding the kind of public violence that would force officials to crack down. They could coordinate with police to make sure that raids and arrests happened often enough to satisfy federal authorities, while avoiding serious disruption to profitable operations. They could provide intelligence about rival bootlegging operations that were causing problems or attracting unwanted attention. The financial results exceeded even Johnny's optimistic projections. Alcohol that had cost pennies per drink in legal saloons now sold $4 per glass in illegal speakeasies. A case of Canadian whiskey that cost $20 to import could be sold for over $200 in Chicago. The profit margins were so extraordinary that they could afford to pay substantial bribes, hire additional security, and invest in expansion while still generating more profit than their old saloon operations had ever produced. Jim and Johnny used their Prohibition profits to strengthen every aspect of their organization. They hired more skilled personnel, expanded their political influence, and established operations in new territories throughout the Midwest. They invested in legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for their illegal activities and provide additional sources of income. They developed more sophisticated methods for money laundering and record-keeping that would help them avoid detection by federal investigators. The adaptability they demonstrated during the transition to Prohibition established a pattern that would define the Chicago outfit for decades. When social conditions changed, when new laws created different challenges, when economic circumstances demanded fresh approaches, the organization would find ways to evolve and profit. This flexibility, rooted in Jim's original insight about making himself indispensable to existing systems, would allow the outfit to survive and thrive through countless transformations in American society. What had seemed like a devastating threat to their livelihood had become the foundation for unprecedented prosperity and power. The gentle street sweeper's approach to building relationships and solving problems had created an organization capable of turning America's greatest social experiment into criminal history's most profitable opportunity. Johnny Torrio had been keeping his eye on another young man from New York, someone who might be able to help their rapidly expanding Chicago operation. In 1919, he brought Alphonse Capone to meet Big Jim, describing him as a reliable associate who understood the business and could handle responsibility. At first glance, Al seemed like just another young tough from Brooklyn. He was stocky and thick around the middle, with scars on his left cheek from some forgotten knife fight. His clothes were a bit too flashy, his laugh a bit too loud, and his manner a bit too eager to impress. Jim studied this newcomer carefully, wondering what Johnny saw in someone who appeared so ordinary. Al had worked his way through several New York operations, learning the trade in pool halls, gambling dens, and neighborhood protection rackets. He understood how money moved through criminal organizations, how territories got divided up, and how disputes could be settled without attracting police attention. Unlike many young criminals who relied purely on muscle and intimidation, Al showed genuine interest in the business side of their activities. He asked thoughtful questions about profit margins, customer relationships, and growth strategies that impressed both Jim and Johnny. During his first months in Chicago, Al spent most of his time observing and learning. He watched how Jim handled delicate conversations with political figures, noting the careful balance between respect and friendship that made those relationships work. He studied Johnny's systematic approach to organizing territories, understanding how detailed planning and careful record-keeping could maximize profits while minimizing risks. Al absorbed these different approaches like a sponge, combining them in his own mind to create something new. Jim found himself drawn to the young man's natural charm and quick intelligence. Al possessed an unusual ability to make people feel comfortable and important, whether he was talking to immigrant workers or wealthy businessmen. He remembered names and personal details, asked about families and concerns, and showed genuine interest in other people's problems. This combination of street toughness and social grace made him remarkably effective at building the kinds of relationships that their organization needed to expand. Al's strategic mind became apparent as he took on more responsibilities within the organization. Johnny assigned him to oversee several speakeasies on the west side, expecting him to follow established procedures and report back regularly. Instead, Al studied the operations carefully and proposed improvements that increased both security and profits. He suggested moving certain activities to less visible locations, establishing better communication systems between different establishments, and developing stronger relationships with local police commanders. The results spoke for themselves. The territories under Al's supervision generated higher revenues with fewer problems than similar operations elsewhere in the city. Customer complaints decreased because Al insisted on quality service and fair treatment. Police raids became less frequent and less damaging because Al had built relationships with officers who provided advance warning when pressure from federal authorities made raids necessary. Other managers within the organization began asking for Al's advice on their own operational challenges. Al's growing influence coincided with the organization's most aggressive period of expansion. The profits from bootlegging had given them resources to move into new neighborhoods and new types of businesses. They established operations in suburban communities where demand for illegal alcohol was high and competition was minimal. They invested in legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for their illegal activities while generating additional income streams. They developed more sophisticated smuggling networks that could transport Canadian liquor throughout the Midwest. This expansion required more aggressive tactics than Jim's gentle approach had traditionally employed. While Jim preferred to avoid conflicts through negotiation and compromise, Al understood that some rivals could only be dealt with through shows of strength. He developed strategies for eliminating competitors without creating the kind of public violence that would force political allies to distance themselves from the organization. His methods were more direct than Jim's, but they were also more effective at securing territory. Quickly, Al began pushing for changes that made the older generation uncomfortable. He wanted to expand their operations into new cities where they could replicate their Chicago success. He proposed establishing manufacturing operations that could produce their own alcohol rather than relying entirely on Canadian imports. He suggested developing relationships with criminal organizations in other parts of the country to create distribution networks for products beyond alcohol. These ideas required larger investments and bigger risks than Jim and Johnny had previously considered. Generational tensions started appearing within the organization as Al's influence continued growing. Jim had built his power through patient relationship building and careful political maneuvering. He preferred subtle methods that avoided public attention and maintained the political protection that formed the foundation of their success. Al respected these achievements, but he believed that changing circumstances required more aggressive approaches. Federal authorities were becoming more sophisticated in their investigations. Competing criminal organizations were adopting more violent methods. Public attitudes toward organized crime were hardening in ways that made Jim's community-based approach less effective. The philosophical differences between generations created real friction within the organization's leadership. Jim worried that Al's aggressive expansion plans would attract federal attention that could destroy everything they had built. Al argued that failing to expand quickly enough would leave them vulnerable to competitors who weren't constrained by traditional approaches. Johnny found himself caught between his mentor's wisdom and his protégé's ambition. Understanding the merits of both perspectives, while recognizing that major decisions needed to be made, Al's natural leadership abilities became more apparent. As these tensions developed, younger members of the organization gravitated toward his vision of rapid expansion and increased profits. Older members remained loyal to Jim's proven methods of careful relationship building and political protection. Al managed these competing loyalties skillfully, showing respect for Jim's achievements while positioning himself as the leader who could guide the organization through changing circumstances. The transformation was becoming impossible to ignore. Al had evolved from an eager student into a strategic thinker who understood both the opportunities and challenges facing their organization. His combination of Jim's relationship-building skills and Johnny's systematic methods, enhanced by his own aggressive instincts, created a leadership style that was perfectly suited to the violent and profitable era that Prohibition had created. Al's arrival had marked the beginning of a new phase in the organization's development. The gentle methods that had served Jim so well in building political relationships and community support would remain important, but they would need to be combined with more direct approaches to territorial control and competitive elimination. The Chicago operation was preparing to become something much larger and more dangerous than its founders had originally envisioned. This transition would transform their local criminal enterprise into a national empire that would define organized crime in America for generations to come. By 1923, something troubling was happening to the carefully built political relationships that had protected Jim's organization for over a decade. Reform movements were gaining strength throughout Chicago, fueled by newspaper investigations and federal pressure that made their old arrangements increasingly dangerous. The same aldermen who had quietly cooperated with Jim's operations were now giving speeches about cleaning up corruption. Police commanders who had maintained friendly working relationships were suddenly conducting raids with genuine intensity rather than the gentle theater they had performed in earlier years. Federal authorities were bringing new resources and investigative techniques to Chicago that made the traditional methods of political protection less reliable. Treasury agents were tracking financial flows with mathematical precision that revealed connections previously hidden in the informal handshake agreements that had sustained the organization. Reform groups were demanding public investigations that threatened to expose the network of mutual benefits that had allowed everyone to prosper together for so long. Jim understood that their survival depended on adapting to these changing circumstances, but he wasn't sure how to modify an approach that had worked so well for so many years. The political relationships that formed the foundation of his power required delicate maintenance that became more difficult as public scrutiny increased. Each conversation with an alderman carried new risks. Each favor requested from a police commander created potential evidence for federal investigators, who were learning to think like accountants rather than traditional law enforcement officers. Johnny and Al studied this challenge with their characteristic systematic approach, looking for solutions that could preserve their organization's strengths while adapting to new threats. They spent long evenings analyzing maps of the Chicago metropolitan area, identifying communities that offered opportunities for expansion without the political complications that plagued their established territories. Their attention focused on suburban municipalities that had grown rapidly during the economic boom following the war, but still maintained the small-town political structures that had worked so well for Jim in his early years. Cicero caught their attention almost immediately. This working-class suburb just west of Chicago's city limits had experienced dramatic population growth as immigrants and factory workers sought affordable housing outside the crowded urban core. The community operated under a mayor-council system, where a handful of elected officials made most important decisions without the complex bureaucracy that complicated Chicago politics. More importantly, Cicero's politicians had no existing relationships with federal investigators or reform movements that might complicate new arrangements. The political structure in Cicero was beautifully simple compared to Chicago's complex ward system. The mayor wielded genuine executive authority over police and municipal services. The town council consisted of local businessmen and community leaders who were more concerned with practical matters, like road maintenance and garbage collection, than with abstract questions of political philosophy. These officials faced election campaigns that required modest amounts of money and relatively few votes. making them far easier to influence than their big city counterparts. Johnny and Al began studying Cicero's economic and social patterns, with the same careful attention they had applied to Chicago neighborhoods. They identified which businesses generated the most revenue, which families held the most social influence, and which political figures made the important decisions. They learned about local concerns like inadequate police protection, limited recreational facilities, and economic development challenges that official channels struggled to address effectively. Their first approaches to Cicero officials followed Jim's proven template of making themselves useful before asking for favors. They offered to help solve practical problems that municipal budgets couldn't address. When the town needed additional police protection for community events, the organization provided security personnel who maintained order without creating incidents. When local businesses faced problems with suppliers or competitors, they offered mediation services that resolved conflicts peacefully. The economic incentives they provided to Cicero officials were more direct than what Jim had typically offered to Chicago politicians, but they were also more sustainable. Rather than occasional campaign contributions or personal payments, they created ongoing business relationships that benefited everyone involved. They helped local restaurant owners obtain high-quality liquor supplies at reasonable prices. They assisted retailers in acquiring merchandise that had become difficult to obtain through normal channels. They provided construction and transportation services for municipal projects at rates that left room for additional compensation for cooperative officials. The combination of practical assistance and economic benefits created genuine loyalty among Cicero officials that went beyond simple corruption. Town council members found that their community problems got solved more efficiently when they worked with the organization. The mayor discovered that his police force could maintain better order with assistance from people who understood how to manage conflicts before they escalated into public disturbances. Business owners realized that their establishments operated more smoothly when they participated in the cooperative arrangements that the organization facilitated. AIL took personal responsibility for managing their Cicero expansion, applying lessons he had learned from both Jim and Johnny while adding his own innovations. He established a local headquarters in a modest office building that served as a coordination center for both legitimate community services and illegal business activities. He hired local residents for various positions within the organization, creating jobs that strengthened their economic connections to the community while providing reliable personnel for their operations. The systematic approach they used to influence Cicero's municipal elections became a model for suburban expansion throughout the region. They identified candidates who would be sympathetic to their goals and provided comprehensive campaign support that included funding, organization, and voter mobilization. They helped friendly candidates develop campaign messages that addressed genuine community concerns, while positioning them as effective leaders who could deliver practical results. Election day operations in Cicero demonstrated the effectiveness of their suburban strategy. The organization could deliver decisive vote margins in municipal elections, where the total number of participants was relatively small. Their political candidates won convincing victories that gave them legitimate authority to implement policies favorable to the organization's interests. The entire process generated minimal media attention because suburban elections rarely attracted the scrutiny that accompanied Chicago political contests. The success of their Cicero operations provided multiple strategic advantages that strengthened the organization's position throughout the region. Suburban territory offered secure locations for manufacturing and storage operations that were difficult to establish within Chicago's heavily monitored urban environment. Municipal police forces in communities like Cicero provided reliable protection for their activities without the complications created by overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting authorities in larger cities. Their suburban strategy created safe havens where organization leaders could operate with minimal risk of federal surveillance or hostile political interference. They established legitimate businesses in suburban communities that provided cover for money laundering and illegal activities, while generating additional revenue streams. These enterprises also created community connections that made their presence seem natural and beneficial, rather than threatening or parasitic. The suburban expansion model they developed in Cicero proved so successful that it became the template for organized crime expansion throughout America. Criminal organizations in other cities began studying their methods and adapting them to local conditions. Recognizing that suburban communities offered opportunities that urban territories could no longer provide safely, criminal organizations across America during the 1920s followed patterns that had been established decades earlier in the Old Country. Italian families worked exclusively with other Italians, creating tight circles based on blood relationships and regional loyalties that stretched back to specific villages in Sicily or Calabria. Irish gangs recruited only from their own neighborhoods, maintaining connections rooted in shared experiences of immigration and discrimination. Jewish criminal groups operated within their communities, using religious and cultural bonds to ensure loyalty and silence. These ethnic boundaries seemed natural and necessary in a world where trust could mean the difference between freedom and prison. Most crime bosses believed that mixing different ethnic groups created dangerous weaknesses in their organizations. They worried that outsiders might not understand the cultural codes that governed behavior within their communities. They feared that people from different backgrounds might have conflicting loyalties or different attitudes toward violence and cooperation. They assumed that ethnic homogeneity provided stronger security because members shared common languages, traditions, and family connections that made betrayal less likely. Jim's practical approach to building his organization led him in a completely different direction from these conventional beliefs. He had started by helping Italian immigrants navigate Chicago's complex systems, but he quickly realized that other ethnic communities faced similar challenges that his network could address. Polish families needed the same kinds of assistance with employment and legal problems that Italian families required. Irish workers could benefit from the same political connections that helped his original constituents. Jewish merchants faced many of the same regulatory and competitive pressures that affected Italian business owners. Jim began forming partnerships with talented individuals, regardless of their ethnic backgrounds, focusing on their abilities and character rather than their ancestry. When he met Jake Guzik, a young Jewish bookkeeper who understood financial systems with remarkable precision, Jim recognized skills that his organization desperately needed. Jake could track complex financial transactions, manage multiple sets of books, and navigate banking relationships in ways that traditional Italian criminals couldn't match. His mathematical abilities and attention to detail made him invaluable for managing the increasingly complex financial operations that Prohibition had created. The organization welcomed Murray Humphreys, an Irishman who possessed exceptional political instincts and communication skills. Murray understood how Chicago's political system worked from the perspective of someone who had grown up within Irish political circles. He could build relationships with Irish aldermen and police commanders that complemented Jim's connections within Italian and broader political communities. His natural charm and quick wit made him effective at managing delicate negotiations between different factions within the city's power structure. These diverse partnerships brought skills and connections that purely Italian organizations couldn't access through their traditional recruiting methods. Jake's financial expertise helped the organization develop sophisticated money laundering systems and investment strategies. Murray's political connections extended their influence into Irish-dominated neighborhoods and city departments. Other ethnic associates brought specialized knowledge about different industries, communities, and government agencies that expanded their operational capabilities far beyond what any single ethnic group could achieve. Jim developed a merit-based system where advancement within the organization depended on performance and loyalty rather than family connections or ethnic background. Members earned increased responsibility and higher compensation by demonstrating their value through successful completion of assigned tasks. This approach attracted talented individuals from various communities, who might not have found similar opportunities within traditional ethnic criminal organizations. The competition for advancement encouraged innovation and efficiency throughout their operations. Their inclusive approach created stronger political connections across Chicago's diverse communities than any purely ethnic organization could maintain. Italian politicians appreciated Jim's continued support for candidates and policies that benefited their constituents. Irish officials valued the organization's ability to deliver votes and maintain order in Irish neighborhoods. Jewish community leaders recognized the benefits of having criminal elements that understood legitimate business practices and could resolve conflicts without damaging community reputations. The organization's multi-ethnic structure allowed them to operate effectively in neighborhoods where traditional Italian criminal groups would have faced resistance or suspicion. Their Irish associates could manage operations in Southside Irish neighborhoods without creating the cultural tensions that Italian criminals might provoke. Their Jewish partners could handle business relationships in Jewish commercial districts, where Italian involvement might have been seen as threatening or inappropriate. This geographic flexibility gave them competitive advantages that purely ethnic organizations couldn't match. Their hybrid model proved more adaptable to changing circumstances than traditional approaches used by other criminal families. When federal investigations targeted Italian criminal organizations, the Chicago outfit could shift critical operations to known Italian associates who attracted less attention from law enforcement agencies focused on specific ethnic communities. When political conditions changed in particular neighborhoods, they could adjust their local representation to match new demographic or political realities without restructuring their entire organization. The diversity within their organization created internal checks and balances that improved decision-making and reduced risks. Members from different ethnic backgrounds brought different perspectives to strategic discussions, helping identify potential problems or opportunities that might not be apparent to leaders from single ethnic traditions. This variety of viewpoints encouraged more thorough analysis of major decisions and helped prevent the kind of groupthink that could lead to costly mistakes. Their inclusive philosophy attracted loyalty from associates who appreciated being judged on their contributions rather than their ancestry. Members developed genuine commitment to the organization's success because they understood that their advancement depended on their performance rather than circumstances of birth they couldn't control. This merit-based approach created stronger motivation and reduced the kind of internal resentment that could weaken organizations based primarily on ethnic hierarchies. The success of their multi-ethnic approach became apparent as other criminal organizations struggled with limitations created by their exclusive ethnic policies, while traditional crime families faced difficulties expanding beyond their ethnic communities. The Chicago outfit could operate effectively across Chicago's diverse neighborhoods, while other groups lost talented individuals who couldn't advance due to ethnic barriers. The outfit retained skilled associates by providing opportunities based on ability. Their hybrid structure became a model that influenced criminal organizations throughout America, though few achieved the same level of successful integration that characterized the Chicago outfit. The inclusive approach that Jim had developed through practical necessity became their greatest competitive advantage, allowing them to adapt and thrive through decades of changing social, political, and economic conditions. This revolutionary approach to criminal organization created a template that would guide the Chicago outfit through its most successful and enduring periods, proving that diversity and inclusion could strengthen rather than weaken criminal enterprises when implemented thoughtfully and managed effectively. Take a moment to imagine walking through Chicago's South Side in 1920 and trying to spot the man who had quietly revolutionized American organized crime. You might see Big Jim Colosimo stepping out of a modest office building on South Wabash Avenue, dressed in a well-tailored but understated suit, nodding politely to shopkeepers and residents who greeted him with genuine warmth. Nothing about his appearance would suggest that this gentle man had created something that would change criminal history forever. The transformation Jim had achieved in just 10 years seemed almost magical when you considered where he had started. In 1910, he was sweeping streets and emptying spittoons, unknown beyond his immediate neighborhood. By 1920, his influence stretched across multiple states. His organization controlled territory from Chicago to New York, and his political connections reached into the highest levels of municipal and state government. The scope of change was so dramatic that even people who had watched it happen found it difficult to believe. Jim's patient approach had created something genuinely unprecedented in American criminal history. Previous criminal organizations had operated like street gangs, controlling small territories through violence and intimidation, while constantly fighting with police and rival groups. Jim had built something completely different, a sophisticated network that functioned more like a legitimate business than a traditional criminal enterprise. His organization provided services that communities needed, maintained peaceful relationships with law enforcement, and generated profits through cooperation rather than conquest. The political protection system Jim had developed formed the foundation of everything else his organization accomplished. He had created genuine friendships with dozens of elected officials, police commanders, and government administrators who protected his operations, not because they feared him, but because they valued their relationships with him. These weren't simple bribery arrangements that could disappear when money ran short. They were lasting partnerships built on mutual respect and shared benefits that had strengthened over many years of careful cultivation. His territorial control operated according to principles that other criminal leaders found difficult to understand. Instead of fighting wars to capture neighborhoods, Jim had made himself welcome in communities by solving problems that official channels couldn't address. His organization provided employment for immigrants who faced discrimination elsewhere. They offered protection for small businesses threatened by street gangs. They resolved disputes between neighbors before those conflicts could escalate into violence. Residents in Jim's territories felt safer and more prosperous than people in areas controlled by traditional criminal groups. The organizational innovations Jim had pioneered created systems strong enough to survive leadership changes and external pressures that would have destroyed conventional criminal enterprises. His multi-ethnic approach attracted talented individuals from various backgrounds who contributed skills and connections that purely Italian organizations couldn't access. His merit-based advancement system motivated members to perform at high levels because their success depended on their contributions rather than their family connections. His emphasis on legitimate business methods created financial stability that allowed the organization to weather temporary setbacks without collapsing. The threads of influence that connected Jim's organization to legitimate political and business power had become almost invisible to outside observers, but they formed a web of relationships that provided protection more effective than any amount of firepower. Aldermen relied on Jim's vote delivery during elections. Police commanders appreciated his help in maintaining order in challenging neighborhoods. Business leaders valued his ability to resolve conflicts and provide services that official channels couldn't offer. These relationships created mutual dependencies that made attacking Jim's organization politically and economically costly for law enforcement officials. Jim's emphasis on cooperation over conquest had established lasting institutional relationships that would continue functioning long after individual personalities changed. The systems he had created didn't depend on his personal charisma or specific political friendships. They were built into the fabric of how Chicago's political and economic systems operated. Future leaders of his organization would inherit not just territory and assets, but a network of institutional relationships that provided ongoing protection and opportunities for expansion. The foundation Jim had built was preparing to support an empire that would span decades and reach across the nation. His organizational model was already being studied and adapted by criminal groups in other cities who recognized the advantages of his cooperative approach over traditional methods based on violence and intimidation. The political protection strategies he had developed would become standard practices for organized crime families throughout America. The business methods he had pioneered would influence criminal enterprises for generations to come. Federal authorities were beginning to recognize that Jim's organization represented a new type of threat that existing law enforcement methods weren't designed to address. Traditional police work focused on solving individual crimes and arresting specific criminals. Jim's network operated through relationships and services that weren't obviously criminal, making it difficult to identify clear violations of existing laws. The political connections that protected his organization made federal investigations complicated because local officials had legitimate reasons for maintaining friendly relationships with him. The challenge facing law enforcement was that Jim had created something that genuinely benefited many people within the communities where he operated. His organization provided jobs, resolved conflicts, and maintained order in ways that official agencies couldn't match. Attacking his network would eliminate services that residents depended on while disrupting political relationships that served important public functions. This complexity made Jim's foundation remarkably resilient against external pressure. Jim's achievement became even more remarkable when you considered the broader context of American society during this period. He had built his organization during a time of massive social change, economic transformation, and political upheaval. Immigration was creating new communities with different needs and challenges. Industrialization was changing how people worked and lived. Prohibition was forcing everyone to adapt to new legal and social realities. Through all these changes, Jim's organization had not only survived, but thrived by remaining flexible and responsive to evolving circumstances. Looking back at Jim's decade of careful building, you could see how each element of his approach had contributed to creating something larger than the sum of its parts. His community service had generated genuine loyalty. His political relationships had provided essential protection. His business methods had ensured financial stability. His inclusive philosophy had attracted talented associates. His territorial expansion had created multiple bases of operation. Together, these elements formed a blueprint for criminal success that would guide organized crime in America for the next century. The gentle revolution that began with one man's decision to make himself useful to his community had created the template for modern organized crime. Jim's insight that lasting power came from cooperation rather than conquest would echo through American criminal history long after his personal story had ended. From a simple street sweeper's dream emerged the template for modern organized crime. Big Jim built his legacy not through violence, but through patient cultivation of relationships and trust. He understood something profound about power that his competitors missed completely. The Chicago outfit's greatest strength would always be Jim's original insight. True power comes from making yourself indispensable to the very system meant to stop you. This gentle approach created something more lasting than fear ever could. As you drift off tonight, remember that history's most lasting changes often begin quietly. One person's careful revolution can transform the world through thoughtful relationships, built one connection at a time. Thanks for staying connected. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every subscription gives us the encouragement to keep creating more gang stories for you.